I want to review assignment 9 today. So welcome back. Hopefully everyone's staying safe and sane. To get to the history stuff. Assignment 9, hopefully I'm going to break up assignment 9 and 10 into different videos. I know I put them together in the same introduction video, but assignment 9 was Frederick Douglass, looking at the videos of Frederick Douglass, and then one of his, like, a short source of his. But we had some really cool ideas from your classmates. So let's start going over some cool stuff. In question 1 said, why was it so important for Frederick Douglass to join the abolition movement? We had awesome answers. Jeevan says, quote, it was important for Douglass to join the abolition movement because he had the experience that none of the white abolitionists had. He was a slave, but he had the drive and the courage to escape, and on top of that, learned to read and write, and subsequently showing the world that blacks are people too. Exactly, like Frederick Douglass's actions were not just that he was able to escape slavery, but he was able to prove to people who had this racist mindset that black folk were not human, and he was able to kind of disprove that and show that. Chris A. said, quote, he was able to live through slavery, escape from slavery, and then share his story with the rest of the world, giving that voice. And then Kishalani says, quote, Frederick Douglass was a slave, and he ran away from slavery. From him doing this action, he was able to speak for slaves and the way they felt. Frederick Douglass makes it out of slavery and is able to tell his story, in which is also spoken related to the enslaved. So it gave, for once, those who are enslaved kind of can relate to something. Frederick Douglass spoke on behalf, she goes on, quote, Frederick Douglass spoke on behalf of those enslaved, giving their futures a form of hope and happiness. Like, spot on. Frederick Douglass being able to escape from slavery and then go on to write about it and spread that voice gives that sense of hope to the enslaved population, which to white slave owners is like their biggest fear. As soon as their enslaved people have hope, they know, white slave owners know, that their whole system is in danger. So Frederick Douglass challenged all that just by his actions. Frederick Douglass is awesome. In the second video, Frederick Douglass used the written word for some of those things that were just mentioned. But slave owners did not want slaves to know how to read or write, and what was the reason? So the question was, what could slaves do if they knew how to read or write? And a lot of you got it, but it was, if slaves knew how to read or write, they can write their own passes in order to travel. And that was a law that was set up that in order for a slave to travel to a city to sell something, they need to have these pieces of paper that say they have permission to do this. And slaves, if they knew how to read or write, could just make their own, and then no one can really prove it. So that was, again, challenging things. Based off the two, and then the next question is, based off the two videos, what made Frederick Douglass so heroic? So one of my favorite questions. Jeevan again said, quote, what made Douglass so heroic is that he not only escaped slavery, but was also a prolific writer, a statesman, an intellectual, and an activist. He did all these things as a black man, something that was at the time thought to be impossible. He proved that slaves were not just tools, but rather individuals. Jeevan, that's exactly what, that's so much the point of Frederick Douglass's actions. Kishalani goes on to say, quote, not only did he run away from slavery, but used his voice to read and write, to give a voice to those who are afraid to speak up for their own. So empowering is being able to lift people up, and Frederick Douglass did that just by being able to tell the story of slavery from a slave's perspective. White abolitionists, could never capture that story because they were free white people, and Frederick Douglass's point was he was able to say, this is actually the story of what these people are going through. And giving that voice created hope, created. We'll go on to the next, and you created like a list of evidence, created proof to these like stories about what people were going through. So just awesome work. Moving on to the second part where he talks about a slave boy learns a lesson. The first question was, according to Douglass's master, why was teaching a slave to read unsafe? So not only that they could write their own passes, but Jeshua noted that teaching a slave to read will eventually lead that slave to escaping. So that was the first, like, teaching a slave how to read or write was their first step in realizing that slaves can do much more. Slave owners wanted to, this was the psychological effects of slavery, but by having their slave population not knowing how to read or write, it kept them stuck in a spot. They weren't able to see the world around them. If slaves knew how to read or write, it gave them a tool that they can use, and then that can build upon and start leading to this type of action, like an action in resistance to white slave owners. So it's like that first like gateway tool for slaves to escape, and Jeshua hits it right there. Question 2, kind of connected. Douglass's master says if he learns to read the Bible, a slave, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. He should know nothing but the will of his master and learn to obey it. And the question is, like, what is the master really saying here? I think Kishalani again hits it. She goes, learning to read or write would give slaves more bigger spectrum to what's going on, or how it might go on when slave owners or white Americans write things on paper. It like gave slaves more strength, knowing the fact that they were able to do what was forbidden and also used against them. Awesome. Like, if a slave can read the Bible, it clues them into a little bit of white culture, but also it just like gives them a piece, a tool, a moment of strength in order to start standing up for themselves. And knowledge also kind of, and being able to read and write gives them that shred of what is lost, and what was taken from them, that ability to learn and that ability to write for yourself and have your voice. That is what is like captured and taken from them in when they were enslaved. Last question. It says, finally, the master says that if a slave learns to read and write, it will, quote, do him no good, but a great deal of harm. What might this mean? What type of harm might the master be talking about? There's, like, sure, there may be a physical punishment if they break the rules of a master, but there's another, like, psychological harm that may exist. And Jeevan says, quote, the harm that the master is talking about is knowledge itself. A slave who knows nothing but slavery may be content in his place, but a slave who knows the outside world, they would become discontent. They would yearn for a different life, become restless, or defiant to the master's command. Jeevan, thank you. That is awesome. Like, that's exactly the point. If a slave learns how to leave her life, they're gonna desire more. Or read or write, they're gonna desire more, and then they're gonna keep pushing. It's this tool, and it empowers them. Chris A. says, quote, slaves will become unhappy when they learn to read or write, and because they will uncover the truth to why they are treated wrong, and their emotions will start to boil in a pot, and they will start to get depressed and other things, since they know that they deserve better. Exactly. It's like, it creates this kind of self-awareness. If slaves know how to read or write, they know that there is something better out there for them. They already know it, but then they can get a taste of it, and they can start to feel it, and that inspires them to do more. So slave owners wanted to keep slaves down, and part of the way to keep them down was to psychologically keep them submissive. And by removing reading and writing, slave owners thought that they could keep slaves suppressed and under their control. And so the act of Frederick Douglass learning how to read and write, and then not only doing that, but then advocating for slaves, was an entire hit back and fight, like a punch back against this psychological control slave owners were trying to enforce on their slave population. So that's what, like, Frederick Douglass, talk about inspiring the movement. Awesome. When we look at assignment 10, we're going to see again more of the eloquence of Frederick Douglass and how he uses his words. So good work, everybody. Nice job. Love it. And I hope you are inspired by Frederick Douglass like I am. Stay tuned. Hope you're all being safe. Miss you.